And more importantly for me, Mike has been a good friend. I've had an opportunity to sit with Mike every morning for probably the last 30 years. I've kind of missed him here lately, but I'm happy to have him back. And with that, Mike, I'll turn it over to you. We look forward to hearing your comments.
Thanks, Steve. Am I sharing?
Perfect. We've got your title screen up and we can hear you perfectly.
Okay, so I selected an interesting titles to hopefully suck some of you guys into listening to this talk. T asked me to gear it to the residents, so I apologize if I'm going to lose some interest of some of the senior attendings. There are no pearls of clinical care embedded in this talk, so I apologize in advance. Okay, I can't advance now. Okay, so the charge from T was to give a personal take on what you have learned as a beacon to our young docs interested in an academic career. So this obviously prompts a look, an end of the year career look back at pathways taken and decisions made. You could wind up at many different places, in your career's end if you had selected medicine instead of surgery, and on and on and on. You can play that game of the what if, and most do at some point in our careers. And I came to the realization that there was a huge impact of serendipity on the development of a career and the progress of a career. So first, I wanted to consider serendipity, and it's the faculty or phenomenon of finding valuable, can't see my slide because everything's in the way, value and agreeable things not sought for. And I think that this poster I found of the Navy once they found out there was water on the moon is a really visual good example of what serendipity is. There's water there, say no more, we're heading out to the moon. So for the career impact of serendipity in retrospect, I think it's great to understand when it's occurring. And then when you recognize that you're in the process of being exposed to a event that could be serendipity, learn how to leverage that event and use it to your advantage as you advance your career. So the first issue that Josh mentioned already was that the going to the Naval Academy was the first probably major decision point that had an impact on my career. I was a 1970 high school graduate at the height of the Vietnam War. The draft was probably imminent. I had frank paternal advice from my father, who was a prior Army Airborne sergeant. He basically said you should think about going to college. Nobody in my family, extended family, had ever gone to college. Then he said, I can't help financially, so figure it out. And then the last one was Annapolis and West Point are pretty good schools. So you might want to consider, those environments. So I applied to the Naval Academy and some other schools and was selected to Annapolis. And, over the course of my career, so this is Army Navy week, and I'll get to that in a few slides. Looking at the two schools and the grads from both schools, I came to realize that Annapolis and West Point grads, despite their differences, they do have one thing in common. And that's that most of us put Naval Academy as our first choice and then went on from our careers from there. So as a sidebar infomercial right here, for those of you that don't know this, this Saturday is the 121st Army Navy game. Navy currently leads the series 61-52 to 7. West Point is favored this year by 7 points. Their record 7-2. Navy's is much worse. And this is the 50th anniversary of my first game in 1970. And I remember the game vividly. It was miserable weather in Philadelphia, rainy and cold. Navy managed to score in the final seconds of the game to go down by 1 point. We had the chance to tie it with a point after touchdown, but decided to go for the win because you never take a tie if you don't have to. So we went to the 2-point conversion and missed it as time expired. And at the end of the game, I realized one other thing. We had to wear these navy woolen bridge coats that went down to your knees, and they're very heavy. And when it rains, the wool basically absorbs the water. And I put on 50 pounds in about 2 hours in the rainstorm. So while I was at the Naval Academy, another event occurred that was formative in my career. There was a draft plan at that time called the Berry Plan. And essentially it was a Vietnam era draft outside of the selected service system. So guys in medical school had a double jeopardy. They had the selective service prior to or while in college. And then in medical school, they were redrafted as doctors. So this was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1970. And the military reacted by tasking the service academies to develop a small, focused pre-medical pipeline that would send at maximum 12 students a year off to medical schools to form a nucleus of a future professional medical department. So I applied for and was selected to be in the first class that went from Annapolis directly to medical school as accepted. During my 4 years at Annapolis, you still had to finish all the other prerequisites in case you didn't get into medical school. And I, did my time on the submarines and my time at sea and learned all the stuff a sailor is supposed to learn in case I was shipbound. Other issues that were formative in career, and it's strictly by accident and serendipity. In 1978, the specialty selection system was much different than it is right now. Essentially, you finished medical school, and in the Navy, at least, or the military, you had two pathways. You could select a medicine pathway or a surgical pathway. So I was interested in surgery because it had military relevance, and was interested in trauma and wanted to be a general surgeon, trauma surgeon. By luck or non-luck, my first 3 months in San Diego, I was Q other night on the trauma service and ICU call. I arrived at the hospital about 3 in the morning, got home about 7 at night, went to bed, got up and went to work the next day. Did the same thing for 3 months. In the 4th month, I was in orthopedics. It was a much more relaxed environment. They said, how many times do you want to be on call this month? I said, well, as long as it's not every other, it's fine with me. Anyway, at the end of the month, I was called into the commanding officer's office, and he basically said, you're going to have a 5th month rotation on orthopedics at the demand of the orthopedic chair. I don't think you did as well as you thought you did. So I'm worried about this. And it turns out that the orthopedic surgeon, the chairman, became a recruiter to his program and then also a mentor. The guy was an interesting guy. He was a prior naval aviator. He flew F-4 fighter jets off carriers in Vietnam. When I finished the 5th month with him, my 5th month rotation with him, he basically ordered me to apply to his residency program. I had to go to sea for a short time, and when I returned to start the program, he called me to his office for the first day meeting. This is where you have to have a little bit of background of naval science. So at sea, you use signal flags between ships so that you can let everybody know what your intentions are without having to use radio frequencies or other things that might be detected. So the flags are now Foxtrot, Uniform, Charlie, Kilo. Foxtrot, Uniform, Charlie, Kilo. So this is the don't Foxtrot, Uniform, Charlie, Kilo it up rule that I've used throughout my career. He basically said, listen, when you're a naval aviator, you have 3 critical events in a mission: the launch, the air action, and the landing or recovery. And then he equated that to surgery. And he basically said a screw up in any portion can be catastrophic. He said, so the rules of my department are simple. He said, it's really simple, just don't screw it up. So he had an ancillary rule too. He followed this with some healthy advice, a fatherly way. And he said, however, the fear of screwing up needs to be an important and healthy component of your professional character. And he finished by saying, because without it, you're going to be a lousy doctor. So I think that I've had a fear of screwing up throughout my career, and it's been healthy, and I think it stood me in good stead. So while in the Navy, as Steve alluded to, I had in my 4 deployments that my wife called my traveling fellowships, and she advised me never to apply for another one. And I spent 18 months at sea in my last 5 years of active duty, rotating between Marine amphibious assault ships, and then finally a 9-month deployment as the chief of orthopedics on the hospital ship, the Comfort, for the first Gulf War. And it gave me, a really in-depth exposure to the other side of the Navy, and to the component of what we were participating in when we put the uniform on. And I learned that I existed in an environment that had over 240. It was a 240-year-old fighting force and healthcare system. That it was in a state of continual evolution. That the individual sailor or surgeon was relatively unimportant. That the team was what was important. There was no room for high maintenance players. Teamwork was required and absolute, and the sole mission was support the ship and keep the ship afloat. And just as a sidebar here for history buffs, one morning at anchorage in the Persian Gulf, we went out on the fantail to see what else had pulled in the evening. And behind us there is, in the middle slide, is the USS Wisconsin, BB-64, a World War II battleship that had been reactivated as a shore support salvo team for planned land invasion of Kuwait City, which didn't have to happen. So anyway, it was a historical event. So serendipity in the Navy, it had an effect on my family too. Only one of my sons ever expressed an interest in going to medical school. However, it provided to me and my family a unique experience outside of medicine. For me, it stimulated major clinical research questions. It afforded lifelong collaborative research opportunities, and the impact that it had on my family was significant. On the left slide, I'm shown with 3 of my sons. As you come back from deployment, we dropped the Marines off in Camp Lejeune, and then the ship's empty, and we had what's called a Tiger Cruise. And you can bring male dependents onto the ship as it sailed back to Norfolk to its final station, and that's about a 3-day trip. So my 3 sons are on board. This is in the 1985 era. Fast forward 15 years, and my sons are coming back from deployment. That's the destroyer behind them. One's a lieutenant JG. And then fast forward last month, these are my 2 sons now. One just got promoted to captain, and the other's a Navy commander, and both are doing extremely well and are well focused to the U.S. Navy. So serendipity, things happen for reasons that none of us can understand sometimes. So I was always interested in impactful clinical research. When I left the Navy, I went to the Baltimore Shock Trauma Center as an attending surgeon. So I was fresh out of the Navy and new staff at the Shock Trauma Center. I had reasonable clinical research questions, but I lacked any exposure or training in clinical research, and was smart enough to self-realize that as a research naive, busy surgeon, I probably wasn't the right person to run or develop a large research project by myself. And I expressed these fears to my boss and mentor at that time in trauma, Andy Burgess, who's my fellowship director when I was a fellow. And he thought about it. And a couple of days later, I got a phone call from Burgess. And he said, hey, come on over to, and you're wondering why the question, most of you might be wondering what's the baseball stadium. It's Camden Yards in Baltimore, and the warehouse behind it's an old warehouse from the 1800s, the longest freestanding warehouse ever built in the United States. And inside of it is called the Camden Club, and it's a restaurant that overlooks the field, and you can have lunch and watch the players practicing. So Burgess called me and said, hey, listen, meet me at the Camden Club because I want to take you to lunch. So I showed up, and Burgess is there at the window watching the practice. And with him is this young blonde lady. And Burgess stands up and he said, Mike, he said, this is Ellen McKenzie. Ellen, this is Mike. He says, I've reserved the table, paid for lunch. He said, you guys need to talk about research. And he goes, I expect good things. He goes, tell me what happens. And he left, and it was pretty awkward. I'm not exactly an outgoing guy, but I was forced to sit down with Ellen and learn about her and her interest and come up with a plan. And as we're talking through this, we agreed on clinical research goals. We thought that good start points were to challenge or compare existing standards of care in order to improve care and outcomes or be more effective. We recognized it required the right question, the right population, and the right strategy, and that was imperative to get a good research project going. that the project would hopefully be impactful if we did one, that it would answer the who cares question and would later be cited by others as something that moved the ball down the field with good evidence-based medicine. So the serendipity for us too at that point in time was in 1990 in orthopedic trauma research, the bar was pretty low. So the quality of orthopedic trauma research was disappointing. There were a few studies that were asking the big questions. Most studies were single-centered. Almost all were underpowered. Most were retrospective, and only a few were employing the evolving patient-reported outcomes tools. Most papers and presentations in trauma at that time ended with the quotation, "A well-designed and powered prospective multi-center study is required." So the table was pretty much set for anybody who could come in with some expertise and a good idea to advance orthopedic trauma research. So at the end of our Camden Yard meeting, after about 2 hours of talking, we agreed that successful orthopedic trauma clinical research should be based on a partnership of a busy and interested orthopedic surgeon and an expert in trial design, methodology, and execution. We targeted limb salvage versus amputation as our first project, mainly because I thought it had significant military and civilian relevance, and there was lots of dogma surrounding the evaluation, care, treatment, and decision-making in the limb salvage high-energy tibia fracture arena at that time. Now, we also made some good decisions by luck or serendipity. And as we established LEAP, we pre-established a number of rules that stood us well as the project moved forward. We decided that we should float the idea of the research concept to major centers and senior surgeons to gauge their interest. And if they weren't interested in this topic, then probably it wasn't worth pursuing. We wanted the project development to be inclusive with all site PIs engaged, i.e. we wanted a buy-in of the study design that they were going to build with us. So it was our project as a group, not my project, not Mackenzie's project. The study would be co-managed by a surgeon and a PhD in a co-leadership arrangement. The steering committee and publications committee would be formed and charged with governing the study conduct and the authorship issues. And the ultimate goal was to successfully complete the first ever NIH orthopedic trauma, compete for the first ever orthopedic trauma award from NIH, and to establish a new bar for the conduct of orthopedic trauma clinical research. So we did get the award from NIH, and about that time, things kind of blew up at Shock Trauma in Maryland, and I needed a different landing place and was looking for other institutions. And I was actually at the academy and was on my third interview and had an offer letter from a different institution I was going to take home to my wife. And Jim Kellum comes down the hallway and he said, I just saw Andy Burgess and I heard you're thinking about moving and going to this other institution. And I said, yeah, I've got an offer letter. And he said, don't respond to it yet. I got back to Shock Trauma after the academy, and there's a ticket on my desk to fly to Charlotte that week to meet with Kellum and Hanley. And so I thought this was interesting. And Burgess said, hey, you got to go look at this. It's an up and coming place. So I flew to Charlotte. It was only the Charlotte Memorial Hospital at that time, a one hospital show. You could feel the energy and you knew it was going to happen. And I went home and told my wife that we were moving, but not to where she expected. We were moving to Charlotte. So the relocation was obviously a good career move for me because I stayed here for 27 years, but it also caused us to relook at the LEAP study. That I couldn't leave the study at University of Maryland because I wasn't there and NIH wouldn't allow it. And NIH wasn't happy about the study coming to Charlotte Memorial Hospital at that time because it had no NIH track record and no grants office, and it was basically a very small operation. So the compromise was we would transfer to the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, which turned out to be a great idea. So this was a big strategic win, short and long-term for us, because Hopkins at that time, and now even still, is not a major orthopedic trauma center. The School of Public Health, however, is internationally renowned. The participating orthopedic trauma teams then viewed Hopkins as a neutral ground, i.e. not a clinical competitor. and it provided all the study sites with a sense of equality. So the LEAP study progressed, and it takes about 7 or 9 years to get these things done. And in the end, we showed that amputation was not worse than a well-selected limb reconstruction, and that both cohorts did poorly. The return to work rates were only 50%, which was disappointing. And there were many predictors of poor outcome, only which few were modifiable, mainly being major complications and probably self-efficacy. And those are the things that should be targeted if you're going to improve outcomes in the future. However, we did recognize that the process of developing and establishing and working through the LEAP study had a lot of secondary gain. It established orthopedic trauma surgeons as capable big study researchers, and the PhD partnership model is a unique opportunity. It developed for us a cadre of collaborative seasoned research surgeons and PhDs that continue to work together on the spin-off papers and other related topics. It supported the academic advancement of all members of the team, and it stimulated spin-off research and lifelong collaborations. At one point in time, it was described by NIH in a publication as one of their best and biggest investments that for only $5 million, they got an article in the New England Journal of Medicine, over 35 other publications, and a Kappa Delta award from the Academy. So I think we met the initial goals that we set for ourselves. So as all these secondary projects in the LEAP is starting to wind down a little bit, 9/11 occurs and we go into 19 years of combat. The early data from the war from Joe Shu and others from the group down at BAMC showed that the majority of the wounds the soldiers, sailors, and Marines were receiving were to the extremity. It was accounting for 50% of all the extremity wounds and all the wounds in 2008, and 65% of the disability cost, and was a huge under-resourced area that required attention. So Serendipity, the LEAP team is still kind of hanging around. The DoD identified critical knowledge gaps in the care of extremity trauma patients and really wanted to focus on gaps with current evidence-based research. They thought this could only be done in a large consortium effort and developed a consortium grant RFP to address these gaps. The LEAP team and the strategy and track record was used as a starting platform for a consortium grant application. And the grant was funded, and Metric was formed approximately 11 years ago. So in the last 10 years, Metric has actually done pretty well. We're now at $130 million in funding for 35 different studies. We've bankrolled the startup orthopedic trauma clinical research infrastructure in over 20 centers around the country that prior to Metric did not have freestanding research centers. Most of these centers are now self-sustaining. Metric has been in more than 75 US trauma centers. It's enrolled more than 20,000 patients, has engaged over 100 site PIs and over 500 site sub-PIs, which means we've engaged and trained and exposed these individuals to collaborative research. And we've trained over 250 RAs around the country in the clinical research techniques. So how does all this apply, this background, to the young surgeons residents sitting in the audience thinking, you know, well, where is he taking this, and how does it affect me, you know, in my future academic career? Well, I think it brings us to the fact that you know, as you go out into practice, you're going to have 4 challenges facing you as a young academic surgeon. You're immediately tasked with establishing a surgical profile and reputation. That's probably first and foremost of your concerns. You have to learn how to get comfortable teaching and giving up your cases to residents and sitting back and letting them do the work and being comfortable that they can do it for you. You have to develop and execute a research plan and get engaged early so that by the 5-year point, you can get promoted and your chairman sees that you're doing something. And you have to learn how to balance your professional and your personal time. Now we're getting into the dogma side. So I finished with my serendipity spiel, and now I'm going to dogma. And dogma is important because you can use this early in your career as the low-hanging fruit for the development of your first few research projects. And I want to define it. It's an established or evolving belief in a treatment or theory that is enthusiastically endorsed by many qualified providers. Good dogma is supported by evidence-based medicine and modern research. And as an example, I'll use the skip protocol perioperative antibiotics. Bad dogma is a belief or practice that evolved over time and is accepted as truth, is typically not supported by modern research methodology. And examples there are, say, the old open fracture rule, the remount had to be done within 6 hours or was malpractice. And then the evolution and use of unringed nails, which became popular, then quickly went away. And I think that the understanding that dogma's out there and that some of it is ripe for good research is a huge opportunity. So there are many life lessons in the Forrest Gump movie, and one is as stupid as does. And the correlation to that for me in medicine is that dogma sucks. You really have to look at what we're doing it, ask why we're doing it, and search for the data that was used to support the treatment strategies. And if there is no data, or if the data is bad, then basically you just found yourself a very interesting research topic. So does the data support the treatment? Yes or no? Is the data modern and current? Has it been retested in our current care environments with the newest methodologies? If the answer is no and no and no, then essentially you've defined yourself a fairly simple and fairly fun research project that may define this existing practice as good and should continue, may define it as something that's okay but needs to be refined, or may define it as absolute BS and you have to move on to something else. So the start point for me always is to assume that most dogma sucks. So the world is not flat, Earth is not the center of the solar system, bloodletting is not therapeutic, capsule thermal shrinkage is not good, the 6-hour open fracture rule is not true, immediate closure of open fractures is not malpractice, and emergent orthopedic fracture fixation does not save lives. And all of these at one point in time were considered dogma worldwide and in the medical communities. So the LEAP study, when we designed it, we actually put some dogma topics in there buried into our research collection so that in the sub-study phase, we could go look and challenge these things. The limb salvage scores were very popular in the 90s. You added up a score. If the score was high enough, it said cut off the leg. Well, limb salvage scores, not valid clinical research tools. Fracture grading by the Castillo system, not good for research or not good in the type 3B fractures because the variation in the injury and contamination is too broad. And we needed to move to something else, and that developed the need for the new OTA, open fracture classification system, which was a demand from the LEAP study once we finished it. Indications for amputation, plantar sensation is not an indication. Indications for more proximal level amputation, atypical coverage of the residual limb does not worsen the outcome. So free tissue transfers and skin grafts are good to preserve length of the limb. And then lastly, through the amputations are not good for LEAP type patients because they perform worse than above the knee amputations. Now this is a true story and a kind of an infomercial here about how sometimes dogma and serendipity are confluent. And this is a case report true story. So there was a debate at one point in time about acute ring nails for femur fracture fixations in the multiply injured patients with thoracic injury. So in 1992, the Germans established that hurt sheep don't like iron nails. They showed that ringed iron nails caused additional lung trauma to sheep with severe shock and lung contusions. Then they moved on and showed that hurt humans don't like iron nails, but this is debatable. They presented the paper at the OTA in 1991, but published it in 93, that showed that ringed nails caused ARDS in patients with severe thoracic injury, and that 33% of those treated immediately developed ARDS, but only 8% developed ARDS who were treated delayed. However, as they presented this paper from the podium, it was, you felt something was wrong. And what was wrong was anybody who died prior to getting the delayed fixation was eliminated. So all those ARDS patients were gone. The numbers are way too small to make the assertions they were making. and the ARDS rates are way too high. The US wasn't seeing 8% or even 33% ARDS rates in those days. So something was wrong with the German data. But this caused a real panic reaction in the orthopedic industry and the orthopedic clinical communities. And there was a new dogma that took hold based on very little data. And the surgeons and industries rearmed with unreamed nails, initiated a whole new set of problems in clinical outcomes. The only good thing that probably came from that whole event was the introduction of the RIA as a device that we now use for a bone graft to harvest. So at this OTA meeting in 1991, Pop A's presenting these papers from Hanover, I'm actually sitting in the audience by accident next to Ellen McKenzie and next to Barry Reamer. Reamer was a contrarian at that time. He was at Pittsburgh Allegheny Hospital, and he's the only guy in the world that still plated every femoral shaft fracture. So we all three agreed that the findings didn't correlate with the experience, that the study was probably poorly done and made no sense. And we immediately agreed to do an acute ream nail versus plate study. Obviously, if you're going to plate it, you're not affecting the femoral canal, and therefore, all the issues about reaming and unreaming are off the table, and it was a perfect control. So we finished the project and published it in JBJS in 1997. We included patients that had injury severity score greater 17 or greater, and with an AIS thoracic injury of 2 or greater. At Shock Trauma Center, all the patients were nailed. At Pittsburgh, they were all plated. And because we needed to show that the treatments were no different at the two centers, we developed a control group that had chest injuries, same injury severity scores, but without femur fractures. And then we found that the care in that control group was equivalent in the ICU. So we decided that we probably weren't seeing, if we saw a difference, or it wasn't going to be because the institutions were different. Anyway, what we found was that there was no difference in ARDS rates, multiple organ failure, pneumonia, or PE rates in patients in the study that were treated by either a nail or a plate. So it's not the ring nail that's causing the problem. The other issue we saw was our ARDS rates were dramatically lower than the Germans at 2 and 3% versus the 8 to 33%. And this is where research becomes fun. It's controversial. That was a controversial response to the Germans. They were well respected at that time from a good center and had published a fairly challenging paper. And this is where it becomes fun too, because you have to negotiate the minefield of publications. So prior to acceptance, the JBJS editor did what was the unthinkable. He didn't believe our data. So as our ARDS rates were much lower than the Germans, he didn't trust our data or the results. So he actually demanded that the two other centers in the US corroborate that the ARDS rates were actually low. So we agreed to this, and they asked Larry Bone Buffalo and Mark Swinkowski and Harborview to look at their ARDS rates in similar patients, and they both came back with 3%. So the US data was 3%, the German data was high. Something was different between the systems, and it wasn't the reaming of the nails. So they finally agreed to, or reaming of the femurs. So they finally agreed to publish the paper. Anyway, off the infomercial and back to Dogma sucks. So metric included some Dogma studies too. It's always fun to do those. The most recent one we just published was that there's a, Mark McQueen has basically stated emphatically that if you have a perfusion pressure that's less than 30 for more than 2 hours, it's an absolute indication for fasciotomy. In the metric study, we blindly recorded the data of the compartments from the patients without knowing what the data was, and treated them, as we thought was clinically indicated. When we unblinded the data, we looked and found that the perfusion pressure less than 30 for more than 2 hours has no correlation with the need for fasciotomy and shouldn't be used as a fasciotomy indicator. We recently showed that in fracture-related infections, they do not require IV antibiotics. PO is good. That for open fracture care antibiotics, the skip protocols at the wound closure are not appropriate for the terminal wound bioburden. They only are effective in 50% of the patients. That for severe tibial fracture fixation, IM nails are not inferior to ring fixation. And for defect reconstruction, bone morphogenic protein is not equivalent to autograft. Autograft is much better. So the CMC has also had its track a record in long run with the Dogma suck studies too. And I'm mentioning just a few of the many. Scannell showed that skeletal traction wasn't bad for the early care of the multiply injured patient. Loeffler showed that autogenous bone graft did not have a high complication rate and should be considered the standard of care for bone graft surgeries. And Nicole Haynes showed that the critical defect in a tibia fracture was less than 3 centimeters, and that you did all these cases that had segmental defects did not require early planned bone grafting, and that most of them would heal without it. Madoff showed that acetabular fractures do not require HO prophylaxis. Scott Middlebrook showed that sciatic nerve monitoring was not required for acetabular fracture surgery. And all these were rules at the time. You know, people were saying you have to do this because it's unsafe. And we basically used our data and showed that wasn't true. Norris showed that post-op CT scans weren't required in most cases to assess for intra-articular hardware. We could do that in surgery with the image. Shu and the group right now are showing that all traumatic knee arthrotomies do not require OR debridement, a longstanding dogma. And Kempton showed that the evolving dogma requiring a negative wound pressure for skin grafting was not, usual dressings was not inferior, and the negative wound pressure was just an added expense. And the list goes on and on and on. So I think that's an example of things that have happened in the past and things to think about in the future. So as you develop your research career, focus on broad-based research themes. You want to improve outcomes by finding current best practices, identify gaps that need attention to improve outcomes, make care more efficient, effective, and less costly, and identify bad outcomes related to existing techniques or strategies, and heed the challenge flag and get that off the radar of practitioners so we don't harm future patients. Clinical research should be fun. So recognize you're participating in an evolutionary process of knowledge. It provides you with a polite forum to dispute prior bad ideas and practices. And it's important to validate or discard dogmas that become embedded in our current practices. So for the young academic orthopedic surgeons, recognize there will always be dogma and that some of it sucks. And that this is the early career low-hanging fruit that you might want to attack to initiate your research agenda as you're engaging yourself in larger, more long-focused trials. But you do want to seek out participation and eventually potentially development of your own large clinical opportunity and trial. Firstly, look for what's established and what's ongoing in your own subspecialty societies. Volunteer your site and your center and yourself to participate as a PI and site in these studies, because you want to establish yourself as an interested PI and capable site. And once you do that, remember, you have to now deliver quality in numbers. And if you're young and you volunteer and you choose to, and you don't deliver or don't deliver quality, you'll lose your reputation and your ability to participate in future studies. Recognize that the big payback on the main result papers from a large clinical trial is a 5 to 9 year horizon. But by joining these other studies, eventually others will join your study. So the last dogma issue that I have is, and this is the biggest one to remember, and this is never going to change, is time is valuable. So you have to learn how to say no to low value targets in order to have bandwidth for tasks that are more important. Early in your career, you need to be a little bit more enthusiastic and more bit open to reasonable requests. But as your career develops, it gets more busy. Consider the importance and impact of projects to your specialty and on your practice, existing projects, and your personal time. So as I went through my career, I developed some personal rules. I never agree at the time of first request, but take time to consider and look at the value and impact of the project on my time, and then respond in 3 or 4 days. And I typically turn down big projects that just want my patience instead of my brain and my patients, i.e. they don't want my buy-in, the study's already written, there's no chance to change it. They just say, will you do the study? And usually the answer is no. It's not a good academic and intellectual exercise. So that concludes my talk. I think recognize in your career that serendipity is going to occur recognize when it's happening and embrace it and ride the wave. And that a dogma sucks is a good mantra to take with you in your early research career, because it's out there. Most of it has to be still tested, and it's a good starting point for your early research projects. So to conclude where I started with my Forrest Gump theme, that's all that I have to say about that. Thanks a lot for inviting me to give this grand rounds, and hopefully I've provided some wisdom to the residents that you can use as you attempt to develop your research career and agendas. And hopefully I didn't bore any of the senior audience that are still present with things that you don't care about anymore.
That's amazing. We'll ask everybody if you could turn your cameras on so we can all see your faces. Bosse, and I worked with you for 20 years and still learned a lot from that talk. Some interesting pearls about the beginning of your career, which is great to hear. Really such a great career retrospective talk. That was fantastic. We really appreciate you putting that together. T?
Yeah, Mike, thanks for probably the best talk we've ever had at Grand Rounds. And more importantly, thanks for a phenomenal example of what an academic career should look like. And I think it's serendipitous that both of us in some way were raised by Andy Burgess up at Shock Trauma. And I had those lunches in the Camden Club like you did, and it was always a great inspiration for my career. Obviously you're attributing a lot to serendipity, and serendipity plays a big role, but I think serendipity and chance favor the prepared mind. So one of the things that I struggled with in my career is going down rabbit holes on sort of undoable projects. So if you were advising our residents and young academic docs on how to avoid those rabbit holes and trying to make sure that what they're working on was high impact, would you have any advice on that?
Well, I think it goes back to the who cares question. If the only person who's going to read the article is you and your mother, and you recognize that most people aren't going to quote you at the end or cite your research, it's probably not worth getting engaged in.
Yeah.
And then the time. I mean, sometimes you want to do research to assist medical students and assist junior residents. You pick small projects, as long as it's not your time and it's their time, and you can manage it. That's okay. But I think the big issue is you have to look at the time requirements impacting your practice, and then the future anticipated impact of the research on your specialty. And if the impact is low, then the question should be, why am I wasting my time?
I was just pausing to see if I'm trying to watch everybody's microphones, if anybody was about to mute.
Can I join in, Josh?
Yes, please.
Hey, Mike, that was really great. I was going to join in and say, go Navy. I'm wearing my Navy veteran shirt today in honor of Mike and the Navy. And hey, there's nothing wrong with being an underdog. That was really terrific. One of the things I think, Mike, if you could just embellish a little bit more on is a phrase I enjoy, which is, you have to value, your coaches and your mentors. And so when you move from place to place, you have to develop relationships, and you have to maintain the relationships that you've already developed. You want to just give a little bit more insight into how that works for the guys that are younger, and how you did that, because I think that, as T said, a good part of this is you, Mike, and a good part of that is serendipity, but you also have to have the ability to develop and maintain those relationships. So can you just speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think, through most academic careers, probably you're going to move once or twice, particularly if you want to take, the leadership roles in other programs. And I think that whenever you go somewhere, you need to look for a like group of people that have a similar mindset. They want to do research. They want to do good clinical care. Your values are their values, so that you're constantly in the same, arena, swimming in the same pool with the same kind of elite people. And I think that's important because it stimulates your thought process and it challenges you to do better things. I think the other thing is, when you move from place to place, you want to move always in good stead. So that, one of the rules, I was taught, early on by, never burn a bridge unless you want to, enjoy the heat, smell the smoke, and feel, and use the light. So shock trauma is still my home. So, I work with the guys up there all the time. And I think it's important to maintain relationships with all your past institutions and to engage those institutions in any future research you might do as you move to your new institution. And you develop this cadre of people that trust you and, like working with you. And then you can, use that as you move through your career. As for the mentors, I think, wherever you go, find somebody who's bigger, older than you, wiser than you, and open to giving you advice, and then, use that opportunity to ask questions, bounce ideas off, and get direction to how best to navigate through your research and academic career.
Excellent. Well, Mike, I'm going to attempt to share my screen here, and we'll check to make sure that everybody can see it and hear. But we have a quick presentation for you. Can you guys hear my microphone here and see the picture?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, perfect. All right, we'll hit play.
Can't
I got
hear.
no sound
No
on that,
sound.
Dr. Pat.
Mike, what's being said that I don't think you can hear is that that you're awesome and you don't suck.
Do we not have volume?
I can't hear it. Can anybody else?
No.
Visual is more important than the volume, though. It's just the things that Steve has already illustrated about you, Mike, and all that you've meant to the program, and the 30+ years that you've committed to our residents and making us great. And the area we're in here is the beginning of what we call the Wall of Fame up in the west wing of the new headquarters. And so this is an opportunity to honor the greats of Charlotte and orthopedics and spine surgery. Skeletal Institute. We want to honor you as the second member of the Wall of Fame here for the Charlotte Orthopedic Chronicles on our 6th floor headquarters suite here. So at this time, Madhav and Josh, would y'all do the honors of unveiling a new portrait? All right.
Hey, thanks, guys.
So, Mike, this is a portrait that was commissioned by Fred Marshall, who is a renowned artist who also did the one previously on Hanley. One thing we didn't notice until recently is this one's slightly larger than Hanley's. So you get your own space back here. And there will be a work area here, and we'll have this to celebrate your career and remember you for as long as this place is in existence. But thanks so much for your contributions to our department and to the education of all our residents and all the research that you've accomplished.
Thanks, T.
Here's a swing of the headquarters building, and wanted to show you what we're going to call the Charlotte Wall of Fame here at the MSKI headquarters. And the first installation is Ed Hanley. And Ed's portrait, as you know, was in our CMC office, and now I think has a much better place that we can have to honor and remember Ed. We've put a committee together with Hunter Dyer, Walt Beaver, and Steve Sims, who will join me in deciding who the next members of the Wall of Fame will be here, because we want to honor that legacy and tradition of Charlotte orthopedics and spine surgery. So please don't be shy about giving us names that you'd like to see here. And over the next couple of years, we'd like to have another 5 folks here on this wall to really celebrate that legacy of Charlotte orthopedics and spine.
All right. Well, again, thank you, Mike.
Thanks, gentlemen. I appreciate it. I'm honored.
So come see your portrait, Mike, when you get a chance.
Okay, you have to put a mask on it.
Mike, let me just throw my 2 cents in too as well. Congratulations on being placed on the Wall of Fame. That really is a big honor because long after people can remember who we are, your picture will be there to remind them. So it's a little scary to have to walk by and look at that every so often. I look forward to doing so. Also, congratulations on a career that I think anybody would be proud of. Mike has really had every leadership position that you can have, and has when orthopedic trauma, when Mike and I started, it was a very small world. We knew everybody, we knew their wives and their children. It's a big world now, and Mike has remained a big fish in a big pond now. So everybody quotes Mike. Everybody will know Mike outside of our institution and within our institution. So Mike, congratulations. It's an awesome accomplishment and an awesome career, and we look forward to having you back to visit with us more often and participate as your emeritus professorship moves forward. So thank you, Mike.
Thanks.
Mike,
So-
on behalf of all of the literally hundreds of residents and fellows that you've taught, thank you for all that you've done for each of our careers, whether it's knowing how to fix a fracture or how to critique a study. We are indebted to you for all that you've contributed to our careers.
Thank you. So so T, you expect a phone call this week from Hanley, because I pass by him maybe once or twice a week at the golf course, and I'm going to tell him that you just hung my picture up next to his, and that my picture is bigger.
Yeah, I'm ready for the heat.
Great. Well, thanks to everybody for tuning in today and helping us honor Dr. Bosse. Great work, and we'll see you all soon. Don't be a stranger, Mike.
Hey, thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks,
Good
Mike.
luck this weekend. Go Navy.
Stay safe.
Hoorah.